The first thing I felt was the sand in my mouth, dry and suffocating. It filled my nose, choked my throat, coated my tongue like ash. I tried to scream, but the weight above me crushed my ribs, pinning me beneath layers of desert grit. I clawed upward, my nails breaking against the packed earth, panic surging in me like wildfire. But the sand was too heavy. I thought of my wife, Lisa, her smile the last thing I'd seen before boarding the plane to Mexico. I thought of my daughter, Emily, her laugh ringing in my ears even now. I thought of the men who'd done this to me, of their smirks, their cold eyes as they shoved me into the hole like garbage. I wasn't going to die here. I clawed harder, tearing at the sand until it shifted, letting in the faintest gasp of air. I pushed, kicked, using every ounce of strength I had left. The desert night was cold, but my sweat burned in the chill. My body screamed for me to give up, but I didn't. Finally, after what felt like hours, my hand broke the surface. I clawed upward, gasping for air, dragging myself out of the shallow grave. I collapsed onto the sand, coughing, my vision blurring under the moonlight. My shirt was shredded, my skin raw from the sand's bite. I lay there, half dead, listening to the desert's silence. They'd buried me alive, thinking no one would find me. But they hadn't planned for the nomads. I woke to the sound of voices, rough but kind, speaking in Spanish I barely understood. They pulled me onto a makeshift stretcher, carried me through the night to their camp. Old women dabbed at my wounds with cloth soaked in herbs. Children stared at me with wide, dark eyes. I was too weak to speak, too broken to move. For weeks, they nursed me back to life. I learned the names of the men and women who'd saved me, their weathered faces lined with stories of survival. They shared their food, their water, their fire. They asked nothing in return. But I wasn't the same man I'd been before. I was Mark Foster, once an investigative journalist chasing shadows of a cartel that everyone else was too afraid to touch. I had thought my stories could make a difference, that truth could cut through corruption like a blade. But I'd been naive. The last story I'd chased had led me to a man named Cesar Luna, a cartel boss who operated with impunity. I'd gotten too close, uncovered too much. The night I was taken, I'd been ambushed outside my hotel. They'd beaten me, dragged me into a truck, driven me out into the desert. And then they'd buried me, alive and screaming. As my strength returned, I sat by the fire each night, listening to the nomads speak of the desert's secrets. They told me of men who disappeared, of caravans swallowed by the dunes, of whispers carried on the wind. I listened, but I also planned. I wasn't going back to my old life. My face was known, my name tainted. Luna's reach extended far beyond Mexico. But I didn't need to be Mark Foster anymore. I could become someone else. I stole glances at the old camera the nomads kept by the fire, a battered relic used to record ceremonies and messages. It sparked an idea in me, something darker than anything I'd ever considered before. I would use my skills, my knowledge, my camera. But this time I wouldn't just record stories, I would create them. When I was strong enough, I left the camp, promising the nomads I would never forget their kindness. I returned to the city under a new name, new face, forged documents. I was careful, cautious. I moved through shadows, tracking down the men who had buried me. I started with low-level enforcers, men who thought they were untouchable. I followed them, watched them, learned their habits. Then I struck. Quietly, efficiently, I captured them one by one, dragging them into abandoned buildings, chaining them to chairs under the harsh glare of floodlights. I made them talk, on camera. I forced them to confess to their crimes, to name names, to describe in sickening detail how they'd buried me, laughed at my terror, their faces twisted with fear, their voices shaking as they pleaded for mercy. I recorded everything, and when they were done, I made them disappear. Some ended up in shallow graves of their own, others vanished into the night, never to be seen again. I edited the footage, carefully, methodically. I cut it into a series of confession tapes, each one darker than the last. I released them anonymously online, each video a nail in Luna's coffin. The public devoured them, horrified but unable to look away. And Luna? He was watching. I made sure of it. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The first confessions had set the fire. But Luna was still standing. His name hadn't yet been spoken by the men I made talk. They were too scared. I needed more than street-level thugs. I needed the architects of the cruelty. The ones who signed the orders, paid the bribes, whispered in Luna's ear. I changed my approach. I targeted a man named Ricardo Vargas, Luna's trusted lieutenant, a slick bastard who handled logistics and cover-ups. He thought he was smart, hiding behind layers of men and false identities, but I was smarter. I tracked him through encrypted chat rooms, coded messages, offshore bank records that he thought were hidden. He was holed up in a luxury condo near the coast, guarded, but not enough. I waited until the early morning, slipping in through the service entrance. My disguise was flawless, my movements precise. When I reached his door, I used a stolen key card and crept inside. Vargas was asleep, sprawled across silk sheets, his mistress snoring beside him. I pressed the muzzle of a silenced pistol against his temple. "Wake up," I whispered. He startled, eyes wide with terror. Before he could speak, I dragged him out of bed, tied his hands behind his back, gagged him with a strip of cloth. His mistress bolted upright, but I leveled the gun at her and hissed, "Stay." I hauled Vargas out into the service stairwell, down to a waiting van I'd stolen 2 days prior. The drive was silent, save for his muffled whimpers. I brought him to an abandoned slaughterhouse on the outskirts, a place reeking of blood and rust. I chained him to a chair under the harsh light of a single lamp. I turned on the camera. This time, I didn't rush. I wanted the fear to settle into his bones, the knowledge that no one was coming for him. When I finally removed the gag, his voice was cracked, pleading. "Please, I'll give you money, anything you want, just let me go." I crouched before him, my voice cold. "I want names. I want details. I want the truth. Everything you've done for Luna, every order, every payment, every body buried in the desert." At first he refused. I expected that. But pain has a way of loosening tongues. I used tools, a blowtorch, pliers, a length of barbed wire. I didn't enjoy it, but I didn't flinch from it either. Finally, Vargas broke. He named names. Government officials, police chiefs, bankers, the whole filthy web that kept Luna's empire intact. He described how they'd found me, how they'd decided I was too dangerous, how they'd taken me into the desert and laughed as they left me for dead. I filmed every second. Then I turned the camera on him, forced him to say it all again, looking directly into the lens. His confession wasn't just a recording, it was a weapon. I uploaded it, timing the release for maximum impact. The footage went viral, headlines screamed across the internet, the public outraged by the raw, unfiltered evil on display. Officials named in the confessions scrambled to deny involvement, but the evidence was too damning. Protests erupted. Luna's world began to crack. But I wasn't done. I turned my attention to the man himself. I knew he was watching, his paranoia growing, his once bulletproof confidence eroding. He was retreating, fortifying himself in a mansion outside the city, ringed by walls and armed guards. But I had spent years learning how to slip through cracks, how to make shadows dance. I spent weeks studying the mansion, learning guard rotations, blind spots in the cameras, the hidden paths through the scrubland behind the property. I pieced together his schedule, his weaknesses, and I found a way in. One rainy night, when the guards were distracted by a delivery truck at the front gate, I scaled the rear wall, crawled through the muddy grass, slipped through a basement window. Inside the mansion was a maze of marble and velvet, empty corridors echoing with the distant murmur of security radios. I made my way to Luna's private study, a room lined with dark wood and expensive art. He was there, alone, hunched over his laptop, typing furiously. I stepped into the light, gun drawn, and his eyes met mine. Recognition flared in them, followed by disbelief, then a creeping horror. "You," he rasped. "Yes," I said softly. He reached for something in his desk, a pistol, I assumed, but I shot his hand before he could touch it. He screamed, falling back in the chair, blood pooling on the polished floor. I approached him, calm, relentless. "This is for every life you've destroyed," I said, "for every innocent buried in your name." "For me?" I didn't shoot him dead. Not yet. I had something else in mind. I dragged him into his private panic room, a steel-reinforced chamber with security cameras and a broadcasting setup. I forced him into a chair, tied him down, pointed the camera at him. This would be the final confession? Luna sat slumped in the panic room chair, his good hand trembling as blood oozed from the shattered one. His breath came in ragged gasps, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead. His lips formed silent curses as he stared at the camera I had set up, red light blinking. I locked the door behind me, pocketed the key, and crossed the room. My own reflection stared back from the mirrored steel walls. Gaunt face, wild eyes, hands trembling not with fear, but with the cold anticipation of justice. "You're going to talk, Caesar," I said, voice steady. "You're going to tell them everything, names, dates, methods, how you ordered men buried in the desert, how you laughed as you turned lives into dust." "I won't say a word," he spat, blood flecking his lips. I stepped closer, pressed the barrel of my pistol against his knee, and pulled the trigger. The bone shattered under the shot. His scream echoed off the steel walls, animal and raw. I waited until he could draw a breath, then crouched before him, my voice soft. "That was your last warning." I pressed the gun to his other knee. "Start talking." He broke. They all did, in the end. The words poured out of him, trembling and broken. He named high-ranking government officials who took his money, police chiefs who disappeared witnesses, judges who made evidence vanish. He described trafficking routes, cash drops, torture sites buried in the desert. Every word was captured by the camera, his face pale and twisted in agony. But I wanted more. I wanted him to confess what he had done to me. I forced him to describe the night they had taken me from my hotel, how his men had beaten me, driven me into the desert, laughed as they dug my grave. He confessed to ordering my burial, to signing off on my execution as casually as ordering a drink, and made him repeat it, staring into the camera, his voice cracking. "Say my name," I demanded. "Mark Foster," he croaked. "I ordered Mark Foster to be buried alive. I thought he was dead." I let the silence hang in the room, his confession heavy as lead. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out something new, a simple black folder, thick with papers, photos, ledgers, the complete, unfiltered record of everything I had learned. The entire network laid bare. I placed it on the table, opened it for the camera to see. "This is the truth," I said, my voice low, "and now everyone will see it." I connected the feed to a secure server I'd prepared. The live stream began. Social media platforms flooded with notifications. Viewers from around the world tuned in, drawn by the brutal, raw spectacle. They saw Luna, once a man of power and wealth, now a broken figure confessing every sin. They heard the truth in his shaking voice. I watched the numbers climb, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. A viral tidal wave. But I wasn't finished. I stood behind Luna, gun still in hand. His breath rattled, his head slumped forward. The comments pouring across the livestream screen were a mix of disbelief, horror, and cold satisfaction. I leaned into the camera, my face filling the frame. "This is for everyone you silenced," I said. "For every family destroyed, for every voice you tried to bury. For me." I pulled the gun back and aimed at the base of Luna's skull. He tried to turn his head, his lips forming a final plea, but I didn't let him finish. I pulled the trigger. His body jerked, then went still. Blood pooled across the steel floor, the sound of the shot echoing into silence. The camera captured it all, unflinching. I didn't stop the live stream. I let it run, broadcasting Luna's lifeless body, the blood, the shattered confession. I left it streaming long enough for the world to see the truth. Then I shut it down. I pocketed the drive, wiped the camera, and left the panic room. Outside, Luna's guards were already in chaos. I slipped through the confusion, into the storm of flashing lights and sirens closing in. But I wasn't caught. I had planned every step, every exit, every shadow to slip through. By the time the news broke that Luna was dead, his empire shattered, I was already gone. But I wasn't finished. There were more names in that folder. More men who had profited from the bodies buried in the sand. More faces to confront with the same cold lens of justice. This was just the beginning. The world watched as Luna's empire crumbled. His confession, broadcasted live, ignited a firestorm. The footage spread rapidly, reaching every corner of the internet, leaving no room for denial or escape. The public's reaction was swift and unforgiving, with protests erupting and authorities forced to act. But for me, the journey wasn't over. The men who had buried me alive were still out there, living their lives as if nothing had happened. I couldn't let that stand. I tracked them down one by one. The first was Miguel, the driver who had taken me to the desert. He was living in a small town, working as a mechanic. I confronted him in his garage, the smell of oil and grease thick in the air. He recognized me instantly, his face draining of color. "Please," he begged, dropping his wrench. I was just following orders. I tied him to a chair, set up my camera, and made him confess. He spoke of the night they buried me, the laughter, the casual cruelty. His voice trembled, tears streaming down his face. I left him there, the recording playing on a loop, a reminder of his sins. Next was Carlos, the man who had held the shovel. He was harder to find, hiding in a remote village. But I found him. He tried to run, but I caught him, dragging him into an abandoned building. He fought, but I was stronger, fueled by years of pain and rage. I forced him to watch the footage of Luna's confession, then made him add his own. He spoke of the orders, the fear, the belief that I was dead. I made sure his confession joined the others, a growing archive of truth. One by one, I hunted them down. Each man who had played a part in my attempted murder was made to face the camera, to confess, to relive their crimes. Some begged for mercy, others tried to fight, but none escaped. With each confession, I felt a piece of myself return. The man who had been buried in the desert was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had faced death and come back. I compiled the confessions into a documentary, a raw, unflinching look at the darkness that had tried to consume me. I released it to the world, letting the truth speak for itself. The response was overwhelming. People were horrified, outraged, moved. The authorities were forced to act, arrests were made, and the cartel's grip weakened. But for me, the journey was over. I had faced my demons, brought the truth to light, and found peace. I returned to the desert, to the place where I had been buried, and stood in the spot where I had clawed my way back to life. I left a marker there, a simple stone with a single word carved into it. As I walked away, the sun rising behind me, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. I had been buried alive, but I had dug my way up and shown them how it feels.